all of human history, the best way to do serious trade was by sea. Even today, most trade is still conducted by sea. Ships could carry a lot more, a lot further and a lot faster than anything on land until the invention of the steam railway. It was from the merchant ships that the Royal Navy recruited most of its sailors. Most sailors in the Royal Navy were volunteers, but it needed a lot of them, and there was simply not enough for both services, especially as most sailors in the merchant service did not want to join the Navy. This wasn't due to the obvious dangers. The pay on board a merchant ship could be twice that on a naval vessel. Even with the wages the Navy paid, manning a warship was expensive. It was so expensive that most major states did not have a permanent fleet. The ships would be kept in reserve, they would recruit sailors to man them when war threatened, and then release them again once peace returned. Keeping ships permanently manned meant constantly recruiting new crew, even in peacetime, to make up for new losses. This is because the biggest cause of death was disease, especially in tropical regions, and disease never stops. When war came, they would call for volunteers who formed the bulk of the ship's crew. The Admiralty did not want to do anything crazy, like offering better pay and conditions, so they had 3 options to fill the gaps. These were conscription, crimping, and impressment. France, Spain, and Denmark used conscription. Every Frenchman between 18 and 60 was required to serve in army or navy. Britain tried to establish an official register of sailors so that they too could use conscription, but most simply refused to join. In 1696, Captain Robertson reported from Portsmouth that he had only managed to register 50 men, and many of them said that they would burn their certificates should a war ever come. More simply refused to be registered. So few men signed the register that it was shut down as not cost effective. The second method is crimping. This was used by both the Royal Navy and the Merchant Service. The best way to describe a crimp is the most underhanded recruitment consultant that you've ever had the misfortune to meet. The Dutch word for it literally translates to seller of souls. Crimps preyed on the destitute and desperate. They told people that they would find them a job with room and board included, and they would even offer an advance on their wages. Anybody desperate enough to take this offer would find themselves stuck on a ship, with the crimper then taking most of their money in order to pay back that advance. Then we get to the Royal Navy's favourite method of filling gaps in its crews, impressment. In 1694, the Navy was pressing men up to 50 years of age. During the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain was basically fighting the entire world, it needed every man that it could get its hands on. They were so enthusiastic at pressing American sailors that it became one of the reasons for the War of 1812, when the Royal Navy went on to burn down the White House. Foreigners and non-Protestants were officially supposed to be not recruited, but when a press gang was operating, they were going to take little notice of things like a person's nationality, if it looked like they could pull on a rope. This is how Moses Benjamin found himself at the Battle of Trafalgar. He wasn't even a sailor. He was a peddler, a small trader, but he got swept up in a press gang. As you can guess by the name, he was also Jewish. This should have been the one and only time that he could use the rampant anti-Semitism of that era to his advantage. British Jews were treated like foreigners, and so they were barred from naval service. But he was scuppered by the glacial pace of naval bureaucracy. By the time his case ground its way through the Admiralty, the ship was already preparing to sail, so he couldn't leave it until it was paid off, like the rest of the crew. All the men got their chance to escape when a ship's commission ended, as a sailor had no job security. Whether it was on a merchant ship or in the Royal Navy, they would sign up for either one voyage or one commission, and after that, they were ashore again. When the Napoleonic Wars ended, the Navy no longer needed or wanted to use the press. This left it reliant on volunteers. The Navy tried lots of ways to attract men to its ship, taking out advertising, but mostly they just crawled the pubs until they'd found enough settlers willing to take the King or Queen's shilling. Miss Louisa Wafer's pub in Portsmouth was particularly famous as a rendezvous, as they were called. But a recruiting party would normally have to visit many pubs in order to get the number of men that they needed. When Captain George Mansell was trying to collect a crew for the Powerful in 1854, he had to crawl the entire southern coast before he'd found enough men. This was because it was rare for a man who had just been paid off to sign up again, when he had still had pockets full of money. They went around the pubs and boarding houses, spinning their dits and enjoying the reactions of all the landsmen when they had said they'd seen people who ate raw meat or drank blood. In Plymouth, sailors would often take their paying off money and buy themselves the fanciest suit of clothes they could, going so far as to have gold coins sewn in as buttons on gaudy outfits of scarlet velvet and lace with gold trimmings. Sometimes they'd pick up an exotic pet from a far-off land, and all this made them stand out as if they were themselves exotic creatures compared to the subdued fashions of the landlubbers. There is a story of a sailor who had managed to accumulate such a vast sum in back pay and prize money that he used this money to pretend to be a gentleman. He bought his way into the best social circles. He took rooms in the best hotel in town. He got his hair dressed and powdered every morning. He even had himself driven around in a carriage. He went to the theatre, staying out late to enjoy everything the town had to offer. Then he used some of his money to hire a sloop to take some of his new friends on a sightseeing trip along the coast. He partied until he had spent every penny he had. But he had partied so hard that his next port of call was the hospital at Stonehouse. However, times were changing. The Navigation Acts were repealed in 1849. This meant that ship owners could crew their vessels with cheaper, foreign labour. This in turn meant that the merchant service could no longer be used as a training school for sailors, as many of them would not be allowed to join the Royal Navy, even if they wanted to. As recruiting got harder, they tried to keep the sailors that they had by instituting a system of continuous service. This meant that after commission ended, the sailors would be paid off and then they would be transferred to the port's guardship rather than being dumped on the dockside. This gave the men more stability and was a significant step in the professionalisation of the Navy. Continuous service was employed alongside the old ways of signing up for a single commission, but the Navy preferred to invest in the continuous service men. They got more training, as this training would not be lost as soon as the ship was paid off, so they were more likely to be promoted. In 1859, there was a commission into the best way to man the Navy. It recommended that continuous service be extended till eventually all the men were signing up for 10 years. While in the service, they were well cared for. They had less drill than in the army, and as well as more chance of seeing the world. Plus, the Royal Navy had such prestige that some of it rubbed off on its sailors. If you like some numbers to compare life in the service, you just have to look at the cause of death. There were 50% more murders in the army than the Navy. There are only 2 suicides in the Navy for every 5 in the army. And in the naval column, a Japanese officer was included who was training with the Royal Navy and had committed ritual suicide for failure. Even in the deaths from alcohol, the Navy comes up better than the Army, despite its rum-soaked reputation. A naval career became so desirable that the Navy could afford to get picky with its recruits. Everybody had to pass a medical, and if there was even a suspicion of a criminal past, then you get thrown out. In 1898, there was a lad who had tried to join from an industrial training ship. He'd been sent to the Clio for refusing to go to school. His time on the Clio seemed to have turned him round, and when he left at 16, he decided he wanted to join the Royal Navy. He's described as having an exemplary character, and it looked like he was going to make a strong and useful sailor. Unfortunately, the Admiralty discovered that before being committed to the Clio, he'd been charged with, but never convicted of, 2 cases of petty theft. So they threw him out. In 1901, a man tried to get around the usual recruitment process by claiming to be a deserter from HMS Lion. He was sentenced to 7 days hard labour when his ruse was discovered. The Navy also liked to recruit its sailors young. It felt that way it could mould them and create a set of good habits. This was a time when simply going to the next town was an adventure, so there were plenty of lads eager to join up and see the world. When they did, they were sent to one of the Navy's own training ships, such as the Lion and the Implacable in Devonport. The products of these establishments were seen as the most valuable part of a ship's crew, and next time I'll look a little deeper into what went on board these training ships.